Greetings, and thank you sincerely for joining me today. I'm grateful you've chosen to spend a moment of your time here. If you find this content meaningful, I'd be honored if you considered subscribing to the channel. Your support truly matters. Let's begin. I'm Wayne. Over time, I came to understand a difficult reality. Many people misinterpret kindness as fragility, patience as ignorance, and compassion as weakness. For years, I lived as the type of husband who always tried to keep the peace, the one who apologized first, who gave more than he received, and who valued resolution more than winning arguments. But on the night my wife stormed out of the house, certain that her dramatic exit would once again bring me to heel, she finally learned that even the most forgiving hearts have limits. Diana and I had spent 11 years together by the time things finally reached a boiling point. One Tuesday in March. You'd think more than a decade would be long enough to learn how to weather the inevitable storms of a shared life. But truthfully, those years were not shaped by mutual effort or balanced partnership. Instead, our relationship became defined by a harmful pattern, one that steadily eroded my self-worth and transformed our marriage into something that felt more like a guardian disciplining a wayward child than a union of equals. Throughout our time together, Diana developed a consistent tactic. Whenever we disagreed, or whenever I failed to meet her expectations exactly as she wanted, she would threaten to leave. In the early years, these moments were rare and relatively harmless, but once she realized the power these threats held, they became more frequent, more intense, and increasingly manipulative. She had discovered a way to gain control, and she wielded it without restraint. Rather than meeting conflict with calm conversation or a willingness to compromise, she would abruptly escalate our arguments by declaring she was finished and walking out. Saying she wanted a divorce or was leaving the marriage became her default weapon, a way to silence discussion and dominate the moment. And every time, in the name of peace and hope, I relented. I would beg her to stay, accept responsibility whether or not I had done anything wrong, and give in to her demands just to stop the chaos. This destructive rhythm repeated itself endlessly over the years. I kept choosing temporary quiet over long-term stability. My constant efforts to be the peacemaker, to apologize, to step back, to sacrifice, may have kept the relationship afloat longer than it should have lasted. But to Diana, these acts weren't seen as love or commitment. They became, in her mind, proof that she was always right, that my concerns held no weight, and that her methods were justified. Eventually, this dynamic shifted the foundation of our relationship entirely. Diana began to believe she held complete control over our lives, while I was expected to carry every burden, emotional and financial, that allowed her to feel free and unchallenged. Her threats became her currency, and I had grown accustomed to paying the price just to avoid another conflict. One moment stands out more than any other. Just over a year ago, without a word of discussion or planning, Diana announced she was quitting her job at the insurance office. There was no prior conversation, no consideration of how this would affect our finances. She simply told me she needed space, time to explore herself, to reflect, to figure things out. Her income, while not extravagant, had been essential. It helped cover the basics: groceries, utility bills, everyday costs. Now, with no warning, those expenses fell entirely on me. When I attempted to talk to her about how we could handle the change responsibly, she lashed out. She accused me of being unsupportive, of holding her back, and declared that if I couldn't take care of things on my own for a while, perhaps she should find someone who could. Confronted with yet another ultimatum, I did what had become routine. I yielded. I told myself that a devoted husband supports his wife through transitions, and I convinced myself she'd return to work once she had time to recharge. But that day never came. More than a year has passed since she walked away from her job, and she's shown no real intention of going back to work. Instead, she's embraced a lifestyle centered on leisure, sleeping in, shopping freely, binge-watching TV, and spending long afternoons with friends who also don't work. Our home has effectively become her personal retreat, where everything is taken care of and nothing is asked of her in return. During this time, she also began making increasingly large decisions without involving me, choices that affected both of us. She booked costly spa treatments and charged them to our shared credit card, knowing I'd foot the bill. She arranged outings and made plans that included me without ever checking my schedule or asking for my input. And whenever I tried to express my concerns or suggested that we should make decisions together, the old pattern resumed. She became defensive, accused me of trying to control her, claimed her independence was being threatened, and once again hinted that if I wasn't satisfied, maybe space was what we needed. Over time, I found myself living under a persistent sense of unease, as though I had to weigh every word and action with extreme caution, even within the walls of my own home. I became more and more reluctant to express my thoughts or desires, afraid that doing so might ignite another argument or provoke new threats. Gradually, I stopped speaking up for myself altogether. My focus shifted entirely to keeping Diana satisfied, convinced that maintaining a fragile calm was the only way to ensure our household functioned day to day. Everything changed one Tuesday evening after a particularly chaotic and demanding shift at work. A planned system upgrade had taken a wrong turn, causing the city's email infrastructure to crash during what should have been a routine maintenance window. I had spent most of the afternoon and well into the evening with my team, racing to get everything back online and verify that all data had been restored safely. Though not an everyday occurrence, these sorts of crises were an expected part of my duties as a senior network administrator. When critical systems fail, there's no waiting. They must be dealt with immediately, regardless of the time. Because of my skills and track record, I was usually the one assigned to troubleshoot the most complicated issues outside regular hours. Around 4 p.m., I called Diana to let her know I wouldn't be home at the usual time due to the ongoing situation. She didn't seem thrilled, but she didn't argue, just asked that I text her when I was on my way. The recovery process dragged on longer than anticipated, and it was close to 9 p.m. when I finally stepped through the front door. I was mentally and physically depleted after a 14-hour stretch of high-stakes, high-pressure work. All I wanted was to shower, eat something simple, and take a moment to decompress before heading to bed and preparing to do it all over again. But before I even had a chance to set my bag down, Diana approached me with a request that made it painfully clear how disconnected she was from the kind of day I'd just endured. She explained that she had spent the afternoon browsing a boutique's website and had picked out several items she wanted to buy before a limited-time sale expired at midnight. The total came to roughly $400, and she needed my updated credit card information since the old one on file was no longer valid. The request was problematic for several reasons. For one, she was proposing a sizable expense without any prior conversation about whether it fit into our budget that month. More personally, the timing felt tone-deaf. She brought it up the second I walked in, without the slightest acknowledgement of the long, stressful day I'd just had. I told her I needed a few moments to unwind, that I hadn't stopped working since early that morning and needed to shower and eat before diving into financial decisions. I reassured her that I was willing to look at the items and talk it through with her afterward, but that I simply wasn't in the right headspace at that exact moment. Rather than showing any understanding, Diana reacted with clear annoyance. She emphasized that the sale would end soon and warned that even a short delay might cause her to miss out on the pieces she liked. It felt as though she interpreted my request for a short break as a personal slight, as if I didn't care about what mattered to her. Despite her irritation, I made my way upstairs, changed out of my work clothes, and got into the shower, hoping the warm water and a bit of solitude would help ease the weight of the day. I spent about 15 minutes in the bathroom, trying to mentally transition from the chaos of work to the supposed comfort of home. When I finally returned downstairs, ready to listen and talk about the shopping she'd mentioned, I was met with a realization that hit me like a wall. Despite having been home all day without any pressing obligations, Diana hadn't taken the initiative to prepare dinner, not even something simple. She was fully aware of how taxing my day had been, knew I'd be coming home late and exhausted, yet made no effort to have food ready or show any sign of care or consideration. In that moment, everything became disturbingly clear. The relationship had become entirely unbalanced. While I was out resolving urgent high-stakes issues and earning the income that kept both of us afloat, Diana had spent the day shopping online and demanding instant access to funds, without offering anything in return. I immediately brought it up, asking her why it hadn't occurred to her to make dinner, especially knowing what kind of day I'd had. I explained that something as simple as having a meal ready would have shown some level of shared responsibility and emotional support. Her reply said more than she likely intended. She snapped that she wasn't my maid and that just because she was home didn't mean she was obligated to cook for me. She insisted she was an independent woman and refused to accept any role that echoed traditional domestic expectations. She took my suggestion as an outdated, even sexist demand. Her words didn't anger me because I felt entitled to being waited on. They angered me because of the double standard they revealed. Diana had no objections to enjoying the benefits that came from my hard work, the home, the comfort, the spending money. But when it came to offering even minimal contributions, like preparing a meal on a day she had entirely to herself, she framed it as oppressive. I asked her plainly whether she saw me as a servant, given that I was the one carrying the full financial load. I pointed out that while she viewed any domestic effort as an affront to her independence, she seemed perfectly fine letting me support us both, without complaint and without help. The question exposed the fundamental inconsistency in Diana's position. She wanted the reassurance of being financially taken care of, yet rejected the obligations that typically accompany that dynamic. She aimed to project independence, despite relying entirely on my income to sustain her lifestyle. Our argument escalated rapidly when I showed no signs of backing down, something I had often done in the past to keep the peace. Instead of acknowledging the legitimate points I brought up about the imbalance in our household roles, she reverted to her familiar methods, heightening the conflict and delivering ultimatums. That evening, Diana announced her departure and ordered me not to contact her again. The flair with which she made the statement was reminiscent of many previous threats, each one delivered with the assumption that I would plead, retract my stance, and yield to preserve what we had. But this time, something inside me had changed. The chronic entitlement, the disregard for what I contributed, and the repeated use of threats in place of real discussion had finally worn me down. Rather than returning to the usual script of apologies and concessions, I looked her in the eye and answered with a single, calm word that would mark a turning point in our relationship. Okay. The impact was immediate. Diana froze, clearly taken aback. My response disrupted the pattern that had reliably served her for over a decade. She lingered, as if expecting me to recant, to offer an apology, to re-engage in the familiar tug-of-war. But I remained still. I said nothing. I made no move to stop her. Once she realized I wasn't playing along, she proceeded with the departure she had declared. She packed lightly, a few changes of clothes, personal care items, and a couple of keepsakes, as though still convinced this was just a temporary measure to jolt me into submission. As she left that Tuesday night, she issued one final, pointed look, as if granting me a last chance to stop her, to beg her to stay, to return to our old routine of avoidance and appeasement. I didn't move. I didn't protest. She walked out, apparently sure I would be calling her within hours, desperate to fix things. What stunned me wasn't that she left, but that, after years of empty threats, she had actually done it. Diana had miscalculated, pushing too far until she was forced to act on something she'd never truly intended. For the first time in our 11-year marriage, I had called her bluff, and the truth became unmistakably clear. Her threats to leave had never been real. They were tactics meant to manipulate, to keep control. She had become so accustomed to wielding the idea of abandonment as leverage that she never imagined what would happen if I stopped fearing it. Rather than waste the night chasing her down, I focused on taking control of my own future. I called the credit card companies and removed her from my accounts. I contacted our bank and restricted her access to our joint funds, effectively ending the financial support she had depended on throughout her long-term unemployment. These weren't acts of vengeance. They were simply the logical steps to take in light of her decision to walk away. If she truly wanted independence, it seemed reasonable for her to become financially self-sufficient as well. I also began researching legal representation and familiarized myself with the steps required to initiate a separation in our state. If Diana genuinely intended to leave and cut off communication, then I would proceed accordingly, decisively and with finality, avoiding the drawn-out emotional limbo that often follows such breakups. The days that followed were eerily quiet. I continued my routine, going to work, maintaining the house, and beginning to adjust to life on my own for the first time in over a decade. The silence was palpable, yet not unpleasant. Without her constant emotional volatility, the house felt calm in a way I hadn't experienced in years. It was then I realized how long it had been since peace had felt normal. Then, on Friday morning, 3 days after her abrupt exit, I heard a knock at the door. Diana stood there, visibly shaken. Her disheveled appearance and uncertain posture made it plain. She was struggling with the sudden loss of financial support. She began begging to return, apologizing for leaving, promising she would never use threats again. She claimed to have had a revelation, that she now understood the importance of our marriage and wanted to be a more responsible, contributing partner. But her urgency wasn't rooted in renewed love or emotional clarity. It came from the stark realization that I had begun dismantling the life she had taken for granted. During her time away, she had tried to access our shared funds, only to discover those doors were now closed. With limited savings and relying on friends for temporary shelter, she had received a harsh preview of what her independence would really look like. Somehow, she had also learned that I had consulted with divorce lawyers. That news seemed to shake her to the core. For the first time, she understood that I wasn't merely waiting for her to come back on her own terms. I was actively moving forward with ending the marriage. Her old strategy, using the threat of departure to maintain control, had failed. Now she was left to face the consequences of a game she had always assumed she could win. Diana's efforts to mend our relationship came across as both frantic and manipulative, veering between promises of personal change and emotional appeals designed to pull me back into the life we once shared. She vowed to find work immediately, shoulder more household duties, and stop using threats to leave as a weapon during arguments. Yet these assurances rang hollow. They seemed less like genuine realizations and more like reactions to her looming financial insecurity. What she truly sought wasn't growth or reconciliation. It was the familiar safety net I had always provided. Despite her words, she made no real attempt to address the deeper issues that had long plagued our marriage: the unequal footing, the erosion of respect, and the absence of mutual accountability. I explained to Diana that her dramatic exit 3 days earlier wasn't a random outburst. It was the culmination of a long history of destructive behavior that had left our relationship fractured beyond repair. I told her plainly that I was moving forward with the divorce. The pattern had become toxic and irreparably lopsided, and no flurry of last-ditch promises, especially those made under pressure, could undo the years of damage. Her reaction was to escalate the emotional pressure. She accused me of being cold and unreasonable, insisting that every long-term relationship faces trials and that I was throwing away over a decade together because of a single argument. But she failed to understand that it wasn't about that one conflict. It was about the years marked by emotional manipulation, threats, and an ongoing sense of entitlement that had slowly worn down my ability to respect her or continue sacrificing myself to keep the peace. In the weeks that followed, She made repeated attempts to change my mind. Sometimes she painted a picture of self-improvement. Other times, she leaned on veiled threats about the financial fallout I could face if the divorce went through. She hired an attorney who encouraged her to frame me as the one who had deserted the marriage, pointing to how I had changed the locks and restricted her access to our joint finances. That version of events was meant to position her as the victim of my supposed callousness. But the facts didn't align with that story. Her voluntary departure, along with documented behavior that included manipulation and recurring threats, painted a much clearer picture for both legal teams and, eventually, the court. The truth was, she had stopped being a true partner long before she walked out. Her frequent ultimatums and eventual decision to leave only confirmed what had been obvious for a while. She had already checked out of the marriage. The divorce took several months to finalize, but ultimately resulted in a fair settlement, one that reflected the financial circumstances we each brought into and maintained during the marriage. She received a portion of the assets and a short-term spousal support arrangement, though it was significantly less than what she might have secured had she been able to prove abandonment or consistent contribution to the partnership over the years. In hindsight, I see how I contributed to the dynamic by constantly yielding to her demands. I had a pattern of giving in during every standoff, hoping that keeping her happy would stave off conflict. But all it did was reinforce her belief that she could manipulate the relationship through emotion, while I silently endured in the name of stability. Strangely enough, the night she announced she was leaving and demanded no further contact became a turning point for me. At the time, it didn't feel liberating, but it was. Her final ultimatum gave me clarity. I saw plainly that the relationship had become one where her comfort came at the expense of my emotional health and self-worth. My only response, "Fine," marked a break in the cycle. I didn't plead, I didn't run after her, and in that moment, I understood that her threats had never been genuine. They were control tactics, not true intentions. She had long depended on the fear of abandonment to keep control. What she never expected was for me to accept her departure without a fight. Cutting off her access to our shared finances wasn't revenge. It was simply a logical step in response to her decision to leave. If she truly wanted to be independent, she had to embrace everything that came with that, including financial autonomy. She couldn't have it both ways, freedom without responsibility. After years of repeated threats, she finally had to face the reality of someone calling her bluff, and meaning it. Sometimes the strongest word in a relationship is simply fine, especially when it's delivered with certainty and finality. And with that, this chapter of my life closes. Thank you for taking the time to listen. If any part of this resonated with you, feel free to explore more content on the channel. Until next time.